Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 11th, 2023. The topic of today's update is, can the war hawks be stopped before they annihilate the human race? We're seeing the outbreak of war in the Middle East, with Israel attacking Gaza, pounding the civilian population there, risking the danger of bringing other neighboring countries into a fight. And the commitment announced by the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is to wreak vengeance against the population. Now, war is not a natural condition of mankind. And the thing that we have to look at is that in modern times, it's the result of powerful special interests that control governments and use those governments for their own purposes, not for the general welfare, not for constitutional reasons, but for enrichment and control. And the typical strategy is to keep a population in the dark so they don't understand what the actual backstory is. Why is there a war? How do we have these new enemy images created? They can use censorship and lies and control of the media cartel to whip up a frenzy in the population, so that the government can go ahead under the direction of private corporate cartels to pursue their interests, even though it goes against the national interest, but attempting to convince you that it's your personal interest to make sure that another nation or another people are destroyed. And so we have the story of the enemy images: Putin the barbarian, the would-be modern Peter the Great, Islamic terrorists, even though there's ample evidence to show that much of the Islamic terrorist movement has been facilitated by Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA. But the backstory is never told. Now, let me give you a little bit of an example of that. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal in June 2009, which described how Hamas was a creation of Israeli military and intelligence. That's right. The Israeli government had a clever idea. And what was that clever idea? To counter the secular and nationalist Palestine Liberation Organization of Arafat, to create a religious movement that would create conflict within the Palestinian population to make it easier to control. This began in the late 1970s. And this was one of those clever ideas, like using Ukraine to defeat Russia, that always comes back with a boomerang effect. But the point here is that you don't know about that. You don't know that the Israeli government was involved in creating Hamas. Now, instead of addressing the legitimate concerns of the Palestinians, which was an attempt made in the Oslo Accords by Rabin and Shimon Peres, but instead of doing that, use a gang counter-gang strategy, which was lifted from the playbook of the British Empire. Now, the gang counter-gang strategy was developed in the mid-1950s during the uprising against the British Empire in Kenya. I mean, it goes way back. This is the old Roman divide and conquer strategy. But in 1955, there was a Kenyan nationalist movement, an anti-colonial movement called the Mau Mau. What did the British do? They created a counter-gang, which they also called the Mau Mau, which burned churches, raped nuns, carried out pillaging, destruction, to try to undermine the popular support for the anti-colonial rebellion. Now, in 1960, a general named Frank Kitson, who was involved in the Kenya operation in the mid-50s, wrote a book called Gangs and Counter-Gangs, where he laid this out. So when they talk about so-called playbooks, there's an actual playbook from British intelligence talking about how you create counter-gangs to divide a population and prevent a solution from taking place. In the case of Kenya, it was to sustain the control of the British colonialism. In the case of the creation of Hamas, it was to defeat the drive of the PLO to establish a legitimate Palestinian state when the whole world supported at that time the idea of a two-state solution. Now, this strategy, divide and conquer, is a form of identity politics where you divide countries up, you divide people by religion, you divide by tribal loyalties, and so on, ethnic relations. But you use these divide and conquer strategies for a bigger purpose. For example, the British attempt beginning in 1900 to make sure that Germany and Russia were kept apart, that's still part of the policy today. And in fact, that goes back much earlier to the middle of the 19th century. That's what geopolitics came out of. The same kind of thing is the Iran-Iraq War. Most people probably don't know this, but the United States supported both sides in the Iran-Iraq War. The Iranian Shiite government versus the Iraqi secular nationalist government of Saddam Hussein provided weapons to both sides, including poison gas to Saddam Hussein's forces to use against the Iranians. So this is an old strategy. Now, how does it work? Well, media control is used to make sure the real story never gets out. And so the picture we're getting today in what's going on in Gaza and in the Middle East is one of national unity behind Netanyahu as a result of the horrific crimes of the Hamas. Now, look, war is always horrible, and the barbarism of both sides, a Hamas slaughtering civilians, but at the same time, you're not told about the effect of the Israeli embargo on Gaza, which now is total, to keep food, water, electricity, to shut down a population of almost 2.5 million people with nothing. But here's an example of where media censorship comes in. Did you know that the leading newspapers in Israel have run editorials attacking Netanyahu and blaming Netanyahu? Let me just give you a little bit of this. In Yediot Ahronot, which is the largest mass circulation publication in Israel, there are two editorials. One headline, Netanyahu and his messianic cohorts must go. And it said that the horrific situation in Gaza is, quote, the result of a catastrophic, perverted list of priorities of this government since it came in January. And it goes through and it says the government and its prime minister, Netanyahu, had no time, will, or interest in dealing with Israel's security, social problems, education, health, or security. Yes, security. This disgraceful failure can lead to only one conclusion, regardless of political views. Enough. Leave. Netanyahu must go. A second commentary was headline, Netanyahu must go. And it said that Netanyahu is the main culprit of the terrible disaster that is befalling us now. His crime? Putting a bunch of racist, promiscuous, terror-supporting bigots into key positions in his deranged government to protect his own skin. And it goes through how the attacks on Palestinians have continued, the assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and so on. And it goes on to say that he was guilty of undermining the Palestinian Authority, which is the last pragmatic and non-fundamentalist Palestinian group with whom Israel could deal. And then there's a third article in Haaretz, which is one of the other largest circulation papers. Netanyahu bears responsibility for this Israel-Gaza war. And it said that Netanyahu, who claims vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers he's consciously leading Israel into with his government of annexation and dispossession. Now, these are stories that should be covered in the American press and the European press, but they're not. This is the same thing that was involved in the continued support for the Ukraine war. We're not told the backstory, the NATO expansion going back to 1990, despite promising no eastward expansion, the Maidan coup, the lies of the Minsk Accord, the lies that there are no Nazis in the Ukraine government. And now what do we have? Deranged lunatics like Lindsey Graham calling for another $100 billion of funding for Ukraine's war against Russia, with virtually complete support from Republicans and Democrats. And again, the background to this, an economic collapse, which I covered yesterday, the demand for wartime austerity, building up the military-industrial complex, and a war to knock out an alternative to a bankrupt global financial system. That's the real story that people should be reflecting on. That's what we're doing to bring the truth out so that people will not just feel hopeless, but actually can have a strategy for taking power out of the hands of the war hawks and the corporate cartels that run them. I'm going to be attaching a leaflet for mass circulation on the description page of today's update. I urge you to read it and circulate it. Join us to bring out the truth so that we don't blindly go into wars that could lead to the annihilation of mankind. For what purpose? For the benefit of handfuls of billionaires who have their hands around the throats of government, and through that, their hands around your throat. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.